Welcome to Our Appalachia. My name is Phil Conn. I'm your host for this series, and today we have a very special opportunity to talk about some of the down-home philosophy and humor that is characteristic not only of the Southern Mountains, but many of the areas of the United States. We have a guest who is from Eastern Kentucky, Gene McFall, and he has distinguished himself throughout the country as an actor and a humorist. But he has some very special ties to Morehead State University, so we're really delighted to have you here on campus, Gene.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Phil.
I should tell them that you're not only from Pulaski County, you're from the area called Nancy, Kentucky. We've all heard of that.
That's right. I'm sure that the people in this area are familiar with Nancy because Dr. Norfleet is from Nancy.
Right.
And you asked me just before we went on the air if I had known him then, and you didn't know that we were related. We were first cousins.
That's right.
I know during the summers that I didn't live on a farm. We lived in Nancy, and my father ran a machine shop, and Dr. Norfleet's father was a farmer, so during the summer vacations I would go down and spend a week or two on the farm. And the one big difference was you had to get up so early on the farm.
Right.
And Dr. Norfleet's father delighted in getting us up early.
Right.
He called us one time, the second time the cold water hit us. So he didn't care whether we heard the first time or not. We got out of bed early.
Well, that's certainly a very interesting time for all of us here at Morehead State University, and you bet that President Norfleet's made us well aware of where Nancy is. I don't guess it's surprising that a lot of people in the Nancy area are related. But you have traveled throughout the country, given your involvement in acting, and right now, of course, you're doing a production called Will Rogers USA, which we'll be talking about and be enjoying. But tell us about your entry into acting. I know you went to Eastern Kentucky University. At that time, did you feel that you would be an actor someday?
Well, having come from Nancy, nobody from Nancy ever expected to be an actor. They never expected an actor to come from Nancy. Of course, they may never have expected a university president to come from Nancy, but in the third grade, I played Tom Sawyer at Nancy Elementary School, and everybody said, gosh, he's good. And you know, schools used to do a lot more dramatics than they do now. Your elementary schools, you had a lot of little plays and everything. Well, I had leads in those, and then in high school, I had leads in the plays. And I thought, well, maybe I've got a little acting talent. But yet, at that time, you had to go into something to make a living. Had I gone to college and majored in drama, my family would have had me committed. There's just no question about it. You didn't do that. You went into education or something where you could make a living. So at Eastern, I have a first major in health and physical education, a second major in biology. My graduate work is in physical education. I never took a drama course. But all the time, I thought, well, maybe I've got a little talent. Now, I had got involved in show business. When I was a senior in high school at Nancy, we had 3 radio shows a week over at Columbia at the radio station with a country music group. And I did announcing and MC work and comedy work with them. So at least I'd kept my hand in it. And even prior to that, before I really got into the acting, while I'd done some country comedy at Renfro Valley, and show business was in my blood. But my wife and I were working in Appalachia. We were working in Leslie County down in Hyden, in an OEO program down there. And I got a chance to use some of my country comedy there, going out to the community meetings. It was a good entree that people say, you know, if you come in with a suit and tie and you're very businesslike, people are a little more hesitant to accept you maybe. So I'd go out and do some of the country comedy. But we left that program and auditioned for The Legend of Daniel Boone in Harrodsburg, the first year of Daniel Boone. And we were cast in it. We took a 70% pay cut and went into show business. That was May 30th, 1966. And it's taken me this long to get what I consider my big break, and I feel that this show is. But we've traveled all over the country. We've lived in Hollywood for about 4 years, and I've done some national television and things like this. But I'm back living in Kentucky and very glad to be back in Kentucky.
Well, we're delighted to have you in this area. I understand you live in Wilmore at the moment.
Right, and people say, how did you wind up from Hollywood to Wilmore? I tell people I went from a city of 3 million people to one of 3,000, from one of the most wide-open cities in the world to one of the most conservative. But it is a great place to live, a great place to come home to.
Well, I can assure you, I taught school in Fresno, California, never made it to Hollywood, but the longer I spent in California, the better Wilmore and places like Wilmore looked. So it makes a lot of sense after you've been around a while to appreciate the rural parts of this state.
It really does, and I've traveled in, I don't know, 38 or 40 states, something like that. And I have found no place I like better than Central Kentucky and Kentucky. It's just, I told a group of ladies the other night that in spite of all belief that the Garden of Eden was in the Middle East, I feel it was in Kentucky.
Right. Well, you know, it's really interesting to me that I meet a lot of folks with dramatic ability from Eastern Kentucky. Now, a lot of times the image, the stereotype, if you will, of Eastern Kentucky is very stoic folks that aren't noted for their social skills. And yet, I have a background loaded with spirited preachers who had no problem getting a message across, people who were very good at expressing feelings and having deep feelings. And I feel that there is a great deal of dramatic talent, much of it latent in Eastern Kentucky. And of course, talking about Eastern Kentucky University, Lee Majors, who was from Middlesboro, I suppose, went to school there, seems to be making it quite well.
Right. I'm just hoping I can get somewhere on his plane, at least his financial plane. You know.
But I guess what I'm suggesting is, do you feel that growing up in Nancy, Kentucky, served you well in the dramatic activity you're involved in now, or is it something you had to overcome, so to speak?
Well, when I first went into acting, I felt that my rural heritage was something I had to overcome. My accent, I had to overcome this. And for several years, I looked at it as a handicap, and the fact that I did not have a degree in drama. But it is very instrumental in what I'm doing today. My rural background, my rural attitudes, the way I was reared, had a direct influence on the producer in deciding to let me do this show. The show I'm doing has only been done by one other actor, James Whitmore. So I feel very honored the fact that I am the second actor in the country to be given this show. And Whitmore has not been doing the show, and I'm hoping to make more or less a career of doing the show, to be doing it for several years. So definitely, my rural background, the attitudes that I grew up with, this producer, one thing he wanted was an actor who would remain true to the man, the honesty of the man, the integrity of the man, of Will Rogers. And of course, Will Rogers, his large appeal, even though he traveled in the company of kings and presidents, his appeal was to the average person. My father, I remember him quoting Will Rogers, and he was very popular with, if you'll pardon the expression, the common man. Not only in the rural parts of the country, but all over the country. But he was very loved by these people because he spoke to them. He did not speak down to them. He spoke on their level. He satirized things that they'd say, hey, that's right, you know, and maybe they hadn't thought of it in those terms, but he was putting in words what people were thinking about politics, about the institutions. There were no sacred cows to Will Rogers. He satirized everything.
I want to talk about Will Rogers more, but I tell you, the best way to introduce our audience to Will Rogers, perhaps, is to let you share his humor and a bit of his background with us by doing a selection from the production that you are now presenting around the country. So let's watch Gene McFall as he shares with us the humor of Will Rogers, and then we'll see how that maybe relates to Southern Mountain folks, their sense of humor, and some of the homespun philosophies that abound in this part of the country.
All right, now it'll take me just a little bit here.
Great.
Changing around and getting ready. But
you make yourself at home and shift into it much the same way he would. You know, I have seen this production. I guess it was done several places around the country, but I saw a TV version of it, and it amazes me that any person would dare take on a 105-minute production alone. So I think our hat's off to you to even command people's attention for that length of time.
Well, I believe I'm about ready here. You know, now, Will, he traveled around. He did a lot of lecture circuits, and he always had his wad of chewing gum, his hat, hair pulled down a little bit, a rope with him, and he never had an act prepared. Never knew what he was going to say in advance. He would just come into an audience, he'd look out, and he'd see the audience, and he'd get his rope ready, maybe do a little spin. Wow, I'm much obliged. You know, folks, I don't have an act prepared. No, I just want to see you folks and chat with you. How are you, for goodness sakes? Now, you know, folks, I am a lecturer. Yeah, now you know the difference between a lecturer and a comedian, don't you? Well, a comedian entertains and a lecturer annoys. Now, most lecturers have written a book,
Yeah, generally on sex. Now, I've never written a book on sex, but, boy, I'll tell you, just as soon as I find out something about it, I'm going to write one. Now, by that, I don't mean that you got to know what you're writing about to write a book. Why, 90% of them never get written, if that were true. No, I just like to know something about sex, even if I'm not going to write about it. Well, let's begin the act, shall we? You know, I always have difficulty starting my act. And, well, you know, there are those who say it's not absolutely necessary to do so, you know. Well, the human race would not suffer appreciably, but what the heck? We're all here. Let's give it a go, you know, till something better comes along. Now, you know, I was born down in the Indian Territory in what's now known as Oklahoma. Now, my father was 3/8 Cherokee Indian, and my mother was quarter-blood Cherokee. Now, I never got far enough in arithmetic to figure out how much Indian that makes me. But, boy, I'll tell you now, there is nothing in my life of which I am more proud than my Indian blood. Now I was born in a little place called Oolaga. Now, only an Indian can pronounce that, so I claim Claremore is my home, you see. I mean, life is tough enough without lugging Oolaga around in your wallet. Oh, now listen here. They just built the first Indian hospital down there in Claremore. Yeah, and they're very proud of it down there. Yep, the first hospital for the Indians in the United States. Now, let's see. Columbus discovered America, what was it now, about 400 years ago. And, well, it's taken us 400 years to build a hospital for the Indians. Boy, just think what us Indians got to look forward to in the next 400 years. Well, they might even build a cemetery for us, you can't tell. Now, when the government shipped the Cherokees out there to Oklahoma, they give them a treaty. Now, I guess you folks know that. They give them a treaty, and that treaty said, you may have this land as long as the grass grows and the water flows. Well, it not only sounded like a good rhyme, but it looked like a pretty good treaty, too, you know, until they struck oil. Then naturally, they took the land back from us. Yeah, they said the treaty refers to grass and water. It don't say nothing about oil. Now, every time a government shipped the Indians someplace, they always give them that same treaty. Now, I don't know why, but they always did. And it always said, you may have this land as long as the grass grows and the water flows. Well, the government has solved the whole thing now. Yep, they just put the Indians on land where the grass won't grow and the water won't flow is what they've done. Now, of course, when I was born, I didn't care nothing about that. I was just a baby after all. Now, listen here, folks. In them days, childbirth was not grounds for a divorce. I mean, any family having not at least 8 kids, the father was either deceased or in jail. Mother and baby doing well was our national yell in them days. Now, I'm the only guy in history that's born on election day that'll admit it. Yeah, that's right now. And most guys denied, but I admit it. I was born on November 4th. Now what happened there was, see, that women couldn't vote in them days, and, well, my mother decided she'd do something to get even with the government for not being able to vote, so she stayed home and gave birth to me is what she done. Naturally, ever since, I've always kind of wanted to get even with the politicians, you know, get even with the government. I always kind of had it in for the politicians.
That's a great selection, and I tell you, that's a super way for those of us in our audience who aren't already familiar with Will Rogers to become acquainted with him. Of course, a lot of the students here haven't enjoyed Will Rogers' humor as those of us who are over 40 have, but you suggested earlier that you were aware of Will Rogers, at least early in your youth, because your dad referred to Will Rogers.
Yep, my dad had always been a Will Rogers fan, and in doing this show, I'm constantly running into people, and they say, well, my dad, one guy says, said every morning I had to listen to Will Rogers. My dad read him his column at the breakfast table every morning. He said, I heard him all my life as a kid. And because Will, see, had a daily column. It was carried in over 500 newspapers. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the young people today don't realize how important a man Will Rogers was.
I don't think so either.
I tell the young people today that in the entertainment industry, there has not been a man as worldwide known and as loved by everybody since Will Rogers until Muhammad Ali came along. And they say, well, he's a sports figure, but that's part of the entertainment industry. And because Will was known all over the world, the only comedian ever to have a statue erected in his honor in our nation's capital. Life magazine one time called him unofficial president of the United States. Had the only comedian to have a United States postage stamp issued in his honor. Nicaragua issued a series of postage stamps in his honor. You know, he traveled all over the world, and very influential in aviation, commercial aviation. That was one of his pet projects. Of course, he died in a plane crash.
Let's talk about his humor for a minute, as it particularly relates to the Southeast and particularly the rural areas, because I find that although Will Rogers was from the Midwest, that a lot of folks in the South feel like Will Rogers belongs to them. Now, what do you think accounts for this? And on a broader plane, what about America in the 30s, early 30s, before he met his untimely death, accounted for his popularity? Why did people identify with him?
Well, I think that Will, and one reason that his stuff is so timely today, you know, people are saying he said this in the 20s and 30s because it applies today. He had the ability to pull a universal ingredient out of a situation. He understood human nature, and of course human nature does not change that much. The politicians today, the same things he laughed about then, we're laughing about today. Doctors, I do a bit in the show on doctors. It is as applicable today. You say, well, that in the 30s he was saying this? And I think it was the fact that he was able to pull a universal ingredient out of it, that he had a good understanding of human nature, and his humor was based on these things within people that everybody laughs at. I mean, we all talk about the politicians, we laugh at the politicians, maybe grudgingly, we may be wanting to knock them, but Will had the ability to go ahead and say these things that the average man in the street was thinking. And Will would say it, and he said, well, boy, you know, that's right. Oh, Will was right on the money then, wasn't he? So, you know, his popularity, he was popular all over the nation and all over the world, for that matter. But I think to the average person, to the working person, and the rural people, because Will had roots. He was a Cherokee Indian, was very proud of his Cherokee roots. Grew up on a ranch. He considered himself a cowboy. And he never took himself seriously as a comedian or an actor. He never considered himself as such. He was still a cowboy.
Well, you were telling me earlier that actually his humor, at least his routine with one-liners and jokes of various types, actually grew out of an act that had to do with his expertise as a rope trick artist.
Will was probably the greatest trick roper that ever lived. He started in South Africa with Texas Jack's Wild West show. There's an interesting little story as to how he got into show business. Will had left Kemper Military Academy at about the 10th grade and didn't go home. He went to New Mexico and worked as a cowboy. Then he decided he wanted to go to Argentina. He'd heard that was a great place for cowboys. So he goes to Argentina. Argentina wasn't what he's cracked up to be. So he shipped out with a boatload of cattle going to South Africa. Seasick all the way. Gets over there and still there's no work. So he hears that Texas Jack is in South Africa with his Wild West show. And he goes down to audition for Texas Jack. And he did a trick what's known as the big crinoline. You take a 60-foot rope and you get it all in one loop going around you over your head like this, and you're in the center of a 60-foot rope, and you get all the rope out. Well, what Will didn't know was that Texas Jack was offering £100 reward for anybody who could do the big crinoline. So needless to say, Texas Jack hired him immediately so he wouldn't have to pay him the reward, because if he was an employee, he wasn't eligible for it. So he toured Africa and Europe with Texas Jack, came back, worked the World's Fair. Then he did go into vaudeville, and he did what's known as a dumb act. This means he said nothing on stage, and he did this for 2 or 3 years. And finally somebody said, hey, Will, some of the stuff you're doing with the ropes is fantastic, but people don't realize it. Tell them about it. So he started explaining his tricks, and then he started making social commentaries, and he was always picking up the newspaper, and he never prepared an act. I mean, he did it. Now, we think of Bob Hope as doing political jokes and stuff. Bob writes his stuff, or he has writers to do it. Will Rogers walked in front of an audience. It doesn't matter whether it's a radio, microphone, or what. He never prepared anything. He'd just pick up a newspaper, or he'd start talking about what happened that day, and it was hilariously funny the way he did it.
Well, you know, you're talking about a lot of things that hit me as also being characteristic of Appalachian humor, and we talk about the humor of this region on our show. For one thing, you've talked about the spontaneity of Will Rogers' humor, and we all know that preachers in the Southern Mountains, other speakers, they're extemporaneous speakers.
They're great showmen in many cases.
And they know how to interact with an audience, read them, and respond accordingly. Other things you pointed out, why Will Rogers was probably very popular in the area, and people still identify with that type of humor. He really enjoyed poking fun at the big boys, the establishment, and in so doing, he continually put himself down. Not that he lacked confidence and pride, but it's just an approach to humor that you knock the big boys, and ironically, you often knock the big boys by way of knocking yourself.
Right.
People realizing that you're not nearly as dumb as either the big boys think or that the world might think. And this seems to be a constant theme through Will Rogers' humor.
And another thing, too, and I think you'll find that the people in Kentucky, in eastern Kentucky, their humor, they don't have a vicious streak.
No.
Now, you take a lot of your satirists, they're vicious. They cut. Will cut with a gentle knife, and he always put a Band-Aid on the wound. I mean, he saw both sides of it. I do a bit in the show that's probably 10 minutes long on doctors. And I mean, a doctor sitting there, he has to laugh at himself. But it's so true, and people are saying, hey, that's right. But yet at the end, he comes down. After talking about doctors and slicing them up for 10 minutes, he says, but you know, there's only one thing wrong with doctors that I can see, and that is you got to be near death to appreciate them. And the same way with politicians. Much of my show is knocking the politicians. You know, one line I like that I added to the script, and George told me I could add it. He says, you know, politics and after-dinner speaking are the two most unnecessary professions in the world. I'm willing to reform if they are. But even after knocking the politicians, he comes down and he says, you know, them guys down in Washington are no better or no worse than the guys that voted them in. And I think they're a good sight better than the people that didn't vote at all. So he saw this, and I think in mountain humor, if you want to call it that, or country humor, you don't, a lot of it goes back to the old Commedia dell'arte. They like slapstick type stuff, but there's not a vicious streak in the humor. And Will was never deliberately hurt anybody with his humor.
Before we run out of time, why don't you pull another section of humor and get into another monologue for us?
Well, let me see it. You know, it's a little difficult pulling it out of context,
Right,
but now, folks, I want you to, I'll just sit here and do this. That's all right, ain't it?
Right,
I'll just
yeah.
sit here and do this now. Now, folks, I want you to run a little political test with me. Will you please? Now, honest, I'm very serious about this. The next time that a politician gets up to speak, see, on something really big and important, just notice he's not saying anything. Folks, you're going to have to listen carefully. The man will slip it right by you. You see, we pay for wisdom and we get wind. Now, they're a sly bunch. They really are now. I don't know what philosophy them birds is preaching. I really don't now, but what? Because, see, I don't have a philosophy. Why, I don't even know the meaning of the word. I never got past 4th grade McGuffies in school, but I'll tell you what I think them birds is trying to do, honestly, is to tell Americans what's best for them. Honestly. Now, I don't think that's too hard to figure out. I think all an American really wants is a hamburger, a one-piece bathing suit, and 5 gallons of gasoline. He's as tickled as a movie star with a new divorce. But now, you know, I'm always poking fun at the politicians. Old Cal Coolidge is a good friend of mine, and all them guys, you know, I really throw a lot of things at them. But, you know, people are always saying to me, Will, how do you get away with kidding the politicians? Well, for goodness sakes, folks, they're mostly friends of mine, and if there is no malice in your heart, there can be none in your gags. Now, I suppose that if I ever have an epitaph, it should read, I have kidded about every prominent man of my time, but, well, I never met a man I didn't like. Now, that summed up Will's philosophy,
Right.
and that is his epitaph.
Right.
That's on his tombstone. That I never met a man I didn't like.
And it showed through. Like you say, regardless of whether he hit folks with barbs, they knew that overall he was a big-hearted, well-intentioned man.
He was a very generous man. In fact, during World War II, a tremendous amount of money he donated to the Red Cross. He did a lot of benefits. One thing that I like in doing this, it's almost a one-on-one humor. Now, I've got to create Will himself. Once I go into the character of Will during my show, I don't step out of the character. But it is Will sitting there talking to people. You know, he's just sitting there. Now, folks, now listen here. Now, let me tell you this. And he goes into all these sorts of things, and it's just a very close feel with the audience.
Right.
You're talking one-to-one to these people, and this was what Will's humor in the newspaper articles, people felt he was talking one-to-one to them. He never talked down to anybody.
Well, like you say, he pitched it at a level where not only could the common man feel that Will was identifying with him, but he championed them throughout, regardless of the audience. The audience knew, regardless of the level, that he was the champion of the little man.
Very
in terms of
definitely,
his style.
because he was always lampooning the government and big business, and he made people laugh at themselves. Now, if he were talking to a convention of ranchers, I mean, he would blast ranching.
Right.
If he was going talking to a bunch of bankers, he would lampoon bankers, but in such a way that people had to see, hey, that's right. He made people, and part of the show, toward the end of the show, I say, I don't give advice, but if I did, I'd say this. You're only on this old world for a very short time. So for goodness sakes, have a few laughs. Don't take things too seriously, especially yourselves. Just live so you wouldn't be ashamed to sell you're the family parrot to the town gossip, that's all. So, you know, he believed in, he laughed at himself. Now, in doing the rope tricks. Now, in the show, I do a few simple rope tricks. I'm naturally not an expert roper like Will was. But I do some of the tricks. And he's always joking about that. He says, you know, I'm going to do you some of these amazing rope tricks I done in a Ziegfeld Follies. Now, the only amazing thing about these rope tricks is that a grown man would do them. And that grown people would pay money to see them. So he was always, you know, he saw humor in about anything. And I think country people, Eastern Kentucky people, they see the humor in it. They don't take themselves all that seriously. They're not impressed with who they are or what they are. They are grassroots people. And I think this is why Will had a lot of appeal. And I have done country comedy at Renfro Valley and other places, and I've done even what we call the baggy pants routine, you know, the funny costume and stuff for the real country hick. And of course the country hick type comic that a lot of people used to do, you used to see them, the baggy pants thing, String Bean and those comedians, Grandpa Jones to an extent, they may have, they lampooned the country guy, but people were saying, hey, that's not really us. They were seeing it as for what it was, a farce on our play on what they were supposed to do.
Well, I really hate we're out of time, Gene, but that is a great note to end on. And I want to thank you for joining us. This has been Gene McFall, and you certainly are making the region proud. We're glad to have you represent this part of Kentucky. I want to thank our audience for joining us on this segment of our Appalachia. Do join us again as we take up another interesting aspect of our heritage and our culture. Thank you very much, Gene.
Thank you very much, and I'd just like to say this, folks. Now, he's talking about a lot of fancy stuff here now. Everybody's ignorant only on different things.
Thanks, man. Pleasure.